To engage with the Quran rationally, consistently, you need a methodology. To really decode what the Quran says and all that it packs, you need a methodology. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Moses, and today I wish to talk about this topic. Why? You might ask, what is the importance of this question? Well, let's just start with one. There is one Quran, one source material. But don't we all know that there are hundreds of different interpretations out there? Even within the same school of thought, we find people with different ideas about what the ayat seem to say. Why is that? Well, all of that, in my opinion, comes down to the lack of a consistent methodology. And that is why I would like to talk about this topic. And by the way, there's another common question that goes along with all the videos that I have presented, and I do intend to present in the future as well, which is, well, how do you understand the Quran? You say this means that, or this is how this should be understood, etc., etc. But what are the foundations that you use to make that claim? In other terms, what they are also asking is, what is your methodology, Musa? How can we even begin to judge you or understand where you're coming from if we do not know your foundations? And I think this is a very valid question, which is not just applicable for me, but it is applicable to all of those who try and talk about the Quran. Hence, today, right now, in this session, I would like to go through 4 key points, which I think are absolutely vital for anybody who wishes to talk about the Quran, including me. First, I would like to present, which I think are very universal and rational fundamentals that should be followed by everybody if they wish to develop a methodology to engage any complex text such as the Quran. I think they are neutral, they are reasonable, they are rational, and when I talk about them, I'm sure that most of those who do wish to engage with the Quran seriously will appreciate and understand and agree with what I will present in there. After that, I would like to talk about and disclose my personal biases, my worldviews, my ways of thinking, which have a direct influence on how I engage with the Quran. So why is it that I think the way I do? What is it that has led me to that certain point? What are the key decisions that I have made when I do engage with the Quran? And along with that, my views on some of the very popular analytical models out there that allow us to engage with complex and meaning-laden, heavy, rich texts such as the Quran. I would like to explore a little bit more on that theme afterwards, as in I'd like to talk about some of the key postulates of my methodology that I follow right now as of this point, and why do I do them. And in the end, I'd like to conclude by basically presenting an overview of what the future looks like, how I think this journey will continue on. A quick word, I am only 5 years old. Despite how many years I've lived on this earth, I have only really seriously engaged with the text for 5 years. So that is the age that I call, or I use to refer to myself and my experience of engagement and deliberations on this Mus'haf. And by the way, I will throughout this discussion use the words Mus'haf and the Quran interchangeably, but I do know that there's a nuanced difference that I'd like to cover one day in the future. So everything that you'll see and hear today is a condensed personal understanding of how the Quran could be and should be engaged. This is a result of honest deliberations on my part, but I'm going to re-emphasize the fact that I am but a student. I'm not going to hold anybody to what I think is what should be done. I'm not going to tell anybody for doing something wrong. I am simply going to present what I think makes sense based upon all the life that I have lived, based upon these 5 years of study that I've done, and I'll offer you rationale and reasons behind those decisions. But this is not an academic treatise or a thesis in which I'm going to defend every single contention or proposition that I present, quite simply because we don't have enough time. So I will get straight to the point, and I will present what I think based upon all of my life experience and my engagement with the Quran over the past 5 years. Right, let's get started. So the first thing I'd like to talk about are, I think, universal fundamentals that everybody should follow when they are trying to develop a methodology for their engagement with the Quran. Fundamental number 1, external, neutral, and academically sound. What do I mean by that? Let's start with this one. We should be very careful that we do not derive the methodology, that is methodology of engaging with the Quran in this case, from within the subject itself. So the methodology that we apply, that we evolve, that we utilize must come from the outside. It must be external to the internal. It should be neutral. It should be academically sound and consistent. We, at the same point, should be very wary of getting into circular reasoning. What do I mean by that? We should not use the text as its own proof. We should not say, well, this makes sense because the text says so and so. So any methodology that ultimately starts from within the subject, I would say, is basically falling prey to circular reasoning. There's no way to reason then, because the only way for you to reason is to use the same text, and you are binding yourself by that, which means you cannot see the bigger picture. So by falling prey to circular reasoning, you end up having a very flawed methodology. Now, having said that we should be always neutral and external and looking in from the outside, there is no reason to say that we should never follow any text-specific techniques, even if they are being suggested by the text itself. However, those techniques that we might derive from the text itself, they must always remain subject to the external world system of checks and balances. That is how the relationship should always work. Now, I know there are some who might not like what I'm saying. They might say, no, to understand the Mus'haf or the Quran or this book that we have, you have to leave everything else aside and look at the methodology that you get from the book itself. And in a way, I understand that argument. But what we are saying is that fundamentally, to even get to that point, you have to start from the outside. You have to look in, and you have to be neutral. You have to be academically consistent and rigorous if you are to derive results that help you explain and understand whatever is happening inside the text. Fundamental number 2, awareness of your internal biases and worldviews. We have to be extremely cognizant that of the fact that our personal worldviews can and do and will skew interpretations. There is no getting around that very simple fact. We should know what our predilections are. We should know what our default positions are. And if we are not, and if we let those become dominant on our thinking whenever we engage with the Mus'haf, we are going to find what we always believed it in any way. We will not find something new in the internal if we allow the external to completely overwhelm the internal. So in a way, these fundamentals, the first two, kind of go hand in hand, where on one hand, you must make sure that the external has got the right influence on the internal. But on the other hand, you must not let the internal be completely dominated by what you came with in the first place. So as in, you should not have any baggage that you bring along with yourself when you engage with a text like the Quran, because then your biases is all you find in the same text that you engage in. I'd like to offer here a few examples. I will not name names. I'll talk about some of the very popular mufassirun, people who engage with the Quran. I'll talk about their work and the way they work, and you'll pick up on who I'm talking about. But the idea is not to criticize the person, but to show how internal biases of theirs has a direct play in what they end up finding in the Quran. Whether they're aware of that fact or not is a different matter. So, number one, there's this group of scholars who try and look at the Quran from a hermeneutic perspective, from an overall holistic mind frame, and that all of that is fantastic. But because they have not been able to detach themselves from the biblical heritage, all the scientific misconceptions such as the flat earth theory, etc., they continue to find in the Quranic ayat talk of the same stuff, where men are one way or the other superior to the women, where the same people that we find in the Bible we find in the Quran, and that the earth is all flat. Or there's a second group who basically say that the Quranic Arabic, well, that derives from specific dialects, whether there's a dialect of the Badu or the Quraysh or this group or that group, etc. So whenever they look at the Quran, they start from that perspective because that is what they believe in. So everything that they do engage with within the Mus'haf, they end up getting that colored by what they came in with. So all the words, which is pretty important for a text, they end up getting looked at from that flawed perspective. Then there's a third group of people who are inherently suspicious of everything and everybody around them. They actually genuinely see conspiracies everywhere. So when they see the ayat of the Quran, for them, in every single ayah of the Quran, there is a disclosure. that they have to divide and cut up the Quran and the ayat in a specific way that only makes sense to them, but that is the right way because that is how they see the world. So there are mysteries and there are these plans and machinations every which way, hence they must exist in the Quran as well. Or there are those who listen to auditory hallucinations, who've got voices in their head. They've got people in their mind that they think are real and they are talking to them. So when they come in and engage in the Quran from that perspective, because they hear voices, anything that does not make sense in the Quran from a narrative perspective, that is attributed to those external voices as well. Then lastly, there's this group of people who, for whatever reason, they like finding patterns in nature or in phenomena. So if they have latched on to a specific pattern of numbers, etc., they end up finding the same pattern within the Quran as well. Taking a step back, I think a fundamental lesson from here is that we should be aware of our internal biases and worldviews and how that has got a real risk of coloring everything that we do. Let's continue on. Selection of an analytical framework. Now, there is a plethora of analytical frameworks out there in literature. Doesn't matter what field that you work in or you start off from, whether it's philosophy or whether it's all of those different methods of engaging with complex texts, in the European French tradition. Doesn't matter. But I think it is a very good starting position for you not to start from scratch. There has been a lot of work done, and it makes sense to start off with an analytical framework that allows you to at least get your bearings right. And it also allows others to start seeing how you're going to structure your arguments and how you're going to form and postulate your end results out of that. Whether it's based upon deconstructionism or historical critical method or literary criticism, whatever the case might be, I think it makes sense for us to disclose what it is that we're using. Now, even if that is something that ends up becoming modified for your particular needs, I think it makes sense for you to outline the differences and the points of variation so people can understand you and you yourself are honest. So you yourself are aware when you start going kind of outside the pale. Fundamental number 4, achieving consistency. Let's start with a litmus test. If the source is self-consistent, free of contradictions and internal issues, then every proposition that we draw from it correctly should also be self-consistent. What do I mean by that? That whatever you present should not have errors, should not clash with anything else that you presented in the past, or what is already present in the Quran that you haven't quite referred to yet. Having said that, and this is the nature of these things, because of the way we as humans are unable to completely 100% latch and clarify reality, we are unable to fully grasp complex texts, which is why, despite this litmus test, there are going to be variations that we cannot quite explain right now. But there must be a way to achieve explainability in the future. There must be a way for us to get to a point where we can justify that. As in, there must be a pathway anyway for us to achieve consistency in the methodology that we end up choosing. Number 5 is, again, I think a very universal fundamental that there should be no disagreement on its adoption, which is we should allow for ongoing refinement. We should embrace continuous growth. We should be prepared to revise findings and theories as we end up getting new evidence or insights. There should be no sacred cows. There should be no sacred cows. And ultimately, as I said in the very beginning, yes, you start from the outside in, and you're wary of the internal not completely overwhelming your external. So there is this dialectics that's in play. But ultimately, if what you are discovering is correct, is valid, then there should be movement from the inside to the outside as well. So a successful model is not just something you present, but something that you end up seeing getting realized in your life, in the life or wherever, or in the domain in which that text sits. So in very simple words, what I'm saying is that a successful model that actually works is where the internal, that which you are engaging with, ends up influencing your external as well. Now, in the spirit of what I said, I'm going to come out clean and offer a disclosure of my personal biases right now, my worldviews, my perspectives and techniques that I've grabbed from these analytical models, and how all of that influences what I use when I talk about the Quran. For example, when I looked at the story of Rasul Lut in the Quran and what happened there, what was my makeup, what was my background, what it is that I utilized from my core to make sense of that very complex story. This is where this comes in. So without further ado, for me, I would call myself a scientific realist. And by that I mean that there are structures and entities in reality that we can never fully prove or understand. And I fully acknowledge that this goes to the ultimate end, where we cannot prove mathematically, undeniably prove the existence of a creator. All we can do is link to that. We can infer evidence. We can have very rational arguments for the way things happen based upon this view of reality. But we may not be able to have a one-to-one mapping of what we see in our domain and the cause of that remains hidden, or the framework of rules that controls and maintains this phenomena and continues for this to exist and happen and recur in the same way. Talking about epistemology, in the same vein, basically, I acknowledge that knowledge arises from engagement interaction. It doesn't really come from the text that we have. It doesn't come from passive consumption. Just because a person's got a book and they're reading it, or there's a YouTube video that they're watching, that's not how they derive knowledge. There is a domain for knowledge where you get that from. So it does not really come directly from the source. There is another mechanism for you to gain knowledge. And that is where I'm going to leave it for now. On the third point now, from my perspective, I appreciate the varied, layered meanings and structures that we find in all great literary works. Language, at the end of the day, is a tool. It is also a means to get to us or the reader towards a certain end goal. So I appreciate that, and that is how I look at literature that I engage with. Let's talk a little bit about the personal makeup of a person as well, because I genuinely think this has an impact on how you engage with complex texts such as the Quran as well. I am a very rational person. I really don't get influenced by emotion or feeling. So when I read and interact with these texts, I don't really have an emotional tool set I can draw inspiration or help from. I really don't. Whether it's a good thing or a negative thing, I don't know. All I can say is that when I read the text, it sadly or luckily remains at the level of logic. I cannot get past that. I cannot find or be moved by emotions. But that is the makeup that I have inherently, which is what I end up using when I engage with the Quran, the Mus'haf. The next one, and the end of the day, no matter how much I learn, no matter how much I try to unlearn all that I learned since I was brought up, some things I cannot change, and the influence will be everlasting on me. I grew up in Pakistan. I was born into a well-to-do Pakistani family. And all of the things that I learned there, the religion, Islam, that I saw there first, that continues to influence me up until now and will probably always do. I cannot completely get rid of it. All I can do is I can acknowledge it. I can say there are some things I can see where that influence is still felt, but there could be many other such avenues where I may do certain things without realizing that I'm being moved by my background. And that is where other people might come into play and say, well, Moses, you probably are saying this because this is how you've always seen it. Moving on, I acknowledge that there are limits to human knowledge, specifically if it concerns texts. Once there is a third party involved that is also trying to interpret it. So it is A, not possible for us to understand everything, but B, there are going to be limits where once interpretation comes into play, a subjective interpretation comes into play, because of these various methodologies and the results that get derived, there are limits even on bridging those gaps. I acknowledge that, and this is not a phenomenon exclusive to those who ponder the Quran, but this is just something we have to be aware of. Next, I, in my opinion, suggest that whenever financial incentives get added onto any project, such as in this case engagement of the Quran and disclosing its secrets, its code, its lessons, its morals, etc., etc., Well, the influence of money taints everything. It does influence what you end up working, what you end up presenting. Next, there is no denying of the fact that the era in which we live in, I live in, you live in, that has an influence on how we engage with the texts. So the engagement of us or as an individual with a given text or given piece of art or anything out there is influenced by what we see outside of us. External does come into play, and it does influence our engagement. And that has been the way throughout the 14 centuries that we've had the Quran. It is nothing unique. It is nothing to be afraid of. It is nothing to shun. It is something that I personally think I have no problems with. I have no problems with, and I actually accept. Next, I do have healthy skepticism of what I see and hear and get presented as accepted history or what did happen. I have healthy skepticism. I do not buy into everything that the governments tell me or people of power want me to believe. I am healthily skeptical of all of that. But despite that fact, I don't shun, I don't push all of that out either. I don't see global conspiracies that have been going on for centuries, etc. That is just not how I am. We can be hallucinated to a certain extent, but to declare that people have been, that the real history has somehow been completely rewritten, I really find these claims hard to swallow. Having said that, I'm also aware that these are some very foundational things. And as more and more I engage with complex texts such as the Quran, I'm aware that if there are any foundational errors there, then they could end up changing everything that I have presented or I've understood, but then the same applies on others as well. And lastly, I acknowledge that my own perspective at the end of the day is that of an observer, which is always going to be subjective, subject to all of the biases that I kind of talked about already. Now, a few quick words on some prevailing analytical methods that we do have right now available to us and how I think whether they fit in when we engage with the Quran or not. So the number one that is very popular is the historical critical method. Again, I'm going to be talking very concisely and very much to the point. This is not meant to be an academic thesis on why I think these things work or don't work. I am in a way presenting what I think right now in order to document where I am right now after 5 years, B, also to give those who are interested in seeing how I think some framework so they can judge the work that I do present. So talking about this particular method, I think that's really inappropriate for the Quran. It just doesn't work because the unique form of the language that we find in the Quran completely makes it impossible for us to place it into a time period where we've got other corresponding texts and materials to help us understand it or deconstruct it or explain some of the harder bits. I don't think that quite works. It's not completely without any benefit, but I don't think that's a method that I can utilize or I do utilize for my work. The deconstructionist method, I personally really like it because I do think this might be a bitter pill for some to swallow, or it might be something that some people might not like hearing, but there is multiplicity of meanings within the Mus'haf. There just is no getting past it. Are they contradictory or are they contrary, or are they similar but they are different? That is a discussion that we can have in its own right. But let's just say that for now, that how we construct meanings and the level of understanding we have with the text, it does end up leading us towards a phenomenon where it seems like there's multiplicity of meanings that are contradictory or if not contrary to each other. But I don't find any problems in the basic principle of that approach. We have to be aware of this phenomena, and as far as I'm concerned, and I'll talk about in the next section, taking this into account, I do have some suggestions and views and practices that I've adopted into my own personal methodology as of right now. Now, third one, gender dynamics. Now, again, it's not something that we would find the Mufassirun of 9th century Baghdad ever engaging in. But end of the day, the Mus'haf does speak to the nafs, which is neither man nor female, and as such, the talk is, I genuinely believe, transcends gender. It avoids the traditional gender biases that we find elsewhere. And that completely changes how we engage with the Quran. So in a way, this theory itself may not give us a lot, but it is very unique and refreshing to see that these inherent issues that we have been finding and grappling with in all of these other texts out there don't really apply to the Quran. Structuralism is a big one because I think any any honest student of the Quran, when they engage with the Mus'haf, they recognize that there are obvious but also some subtle structures within the text. Sometimes you can feel them. Sometimes you can actually see them in front of you. Sometimes they begin to take form the more and more you engage with it. And this is something that even the traditional cycle has done quite a lot of work on, which is a good thing. So I think of all the methods that I'll probably say would be the least controversial that we should all follow and utilize would be this one. The next one, hermeneutics, is in viewing the text as a whole rather than in isolated parts, or saying that I would take it the next level and I'll say, when you put all of this together, the sum of the parts is actually greater than the total. That is my understanding of the Mus'haf. You can't really understand this Mus'haf if you break it up, because the moment you start doing it, you end up taking very, very strange perspectives. But when you present it all together, when you put this into context, when you look at this from as a whole, then what you get, the sum of the parts, that is a very valid way of engaging with the Mus'haf. Anything short of that, I don't think works. The next thing I think we could derive from, and I do derive from, is narratology. Quran has got a very unique narrative style, an extremely unique narrative style. I've spoken about this before in the past. I am a sci-fi and epic fantasy author. I've got 6 books out there. I have written a PhD. I've written many academic articles before. I read books every day in 3 languages. Thousands of books, if not more, I have read throughout my life. I have presented in some very formal structures. So I know how to write formal English. I talk informally in English. I have been part of the media where we engage or try and use very persuasive language. What I'm trying to say is, having seen all of that, I find the narrative style of the Quran to be absolutely unique, refreshingly so, challengingly so. So the modern techniques or the traditional techniques of the narrative modes, etc., though they cannot be applied to the Quran, I think they do offer us certain tools that we could derive, and I do derive, for us to understand the Quran. Theological content, very quick word. I don't think we'll find anybody could say that we'll find religious minutiae in the Quran. So whilst it's not quite book of theology, yes, I know that there are certain parts of the Mus'haf that could be taken to be suggesting that. So we should be aware and cognizant of those parts. And lastly, I do think that there are archetypes that are being presented in the Mus'haf, and there are tools and techniques that we can grab, and I do utilize for my engagement with the Mus'haf. There are universal themes. These personalities that we see in the Mus'haf, they're not bound in time. They're not just snapshots of history recorded just for historical purposes, but they reflect, as I said, universal themes and human experiences. And we have to be aware of that and use that from a methodological perspective to build upon our understanding. Okay, 5 years of study later, I will now like to present my methodology as it is right now, or at least some of the absolute fundamental points, some of the key decisions that I have made, which influence how I understand and engage with the Mus'haf. Now, number 1 is probably the most important point out there. We have to utilize all the comprehensive analytical tools that we have at our disposal. What does that mean? That means all instruments of human logic and understanding that we have ever built as a human species to interpret texts, repositories of knowledge. For example, grammar, history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, folklore, logic and its tools, such as futility of appealing to history and majority, political theory, scientific tools and paradigms, experiences in writing, etc., etc. We have to use all of that. All of that. I strive to increase and enrich my arsenal every day. And I think this is something that, again, we should not hopefully disagree on. Second is, I generally believe that we have to be academically neutral whilst being aware of our inbuilt biases, as I talked about in the last section. When I start work, as much as it is possible, I try to start that with an open mind, willing to ignore initial thoughts and ideas. And it's something I'll talk about when I I'll talk about this point more when I present my next video, which is probably going to be a controversial one, where a lot of people will not like what I say. But I was there, and I let the Quran change my view on that. The third one is going back to the point that we were talking about before. I think hermeneutics really offers us great value for engaging with the Quran from a holistic overall perspective. We must not, I try not, cherry pick this and that to paint a narrative that suits a certain agenda, or because of a bias that I've already held, or because it fits in with what I kind of know or knew already to be correct. The next part, as part of this, when we engage in the contextual analysis, I think there's some pitfalls that we must be aware of, that I'm trying to remind myself of every single day. Let's talk about this a little bit more before we go on to the next point. Whenever we look at the Quran or any particular section, some things are absolutely vital. We need to know who's talking, who's engaging, to whom, why, and how. This understanding allows for interpretation of why certain words, motifs, and themes are utilized. And when we, in the same vein, when we see the same event being referred to elsewhere, if there are slight differences in words, the prepositions, the word cloud, anything like that, be very, very wary, because that can change and influence the final meaning. One more thing on that. There are two ways of kind of understanding a term or understanding something in the Mus'haf. Either you start with a collection of all the key terms and then you look at the context, or you start with the context, understand, derive the meaning of terms, and then apply them elsewhere. No matter which way how you start, they must be in the end harmonized. Again, I'll talk about this more and how I've done that for my next video. Let's go on to the next point. I try personally forming hypotheses and then applying them one by one to the source material, as in, I think this is this, or A equals B, and there is a reason for that. Now, whatever that hypothesis might be, it needs to be applied to the source material. If they don't harmonize, if it doesn't make sense, if you find contradictions, start again. As part of that, and again being neutral and academically sound in your way, there is no harm at all at consulting other people's work, literature that's already done. We call it literature review. If you ever do a master's degree or PhD, you do a literature review to find what people have done before you. There's no harm in doing that to make sure you're not doing any foundational obvious mistakes. Again, don't let the external influence the internal, but at least start the right way. And when you are ready to present your hypotheses, your results to the world, it is excellent if you can to have them peer-reviewed, challenged by someone knowledgeable beforehand. As much as possible, I do try to do that. Let's go on to the next point. The Quranic Arabic, and I'm very, very firm on this point. It is not derived from another language, whether it's Syriac or Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever the names might get thrown. It is not derived from another language. Even if there are so-called loan words in the Quran, they have been Arabized in the Mus'haf. Through the Amal of Ta'arib, they have changed. They have been incorporated and used in the Quranic way and not the way they were used before. And that is a phenomenon that we see in all languages today. Some of the words of Arabic nature, once they have migrated into Urdu, my first language, the meanings and the mafhum have changed, and that is normal, and that is something that we must be aware of. On the same topic of language, I think we have to pay specific attention. I do try and do that to how the words are written out, especially when the same word may have two different writing mechanisms, but is pronounced the same way. Why? There is a question there that needs to be answered and looked into. In the same vein, I do not think that there are any extra words or huruf in the Mus'haf. Everything there is for a specific reason. We cannot cannot delete things and say, oh, even if you take these 4 or 5 words out, the meaning doesn't change. If that is the case, well, then the argument you're making is that the text you're engaging with has got superfluous stuff in it. It's got hashu, it's got extraneous stuff that you could take out and nothing changes. If that is the case, then what you're really saying is this is not the work of a perfect being. It is a human work. And if that is what you end up wanting to say, well, so be it. But as far as my experience with the Mus'haf so far is or entails, I have seen the reverse, which is every single harf, every single word that others might say is extraneous, I have found those to add semantic value. So there's extreme specificity and rigidity and integrity in the way the Mus'haf uses its words. Now, one more point I'll make there about the language, and I know this is going to be also controversial, but I'll mention this in passing and move on, and maybe I'll pick up on this later. For whatever reason, there are certain words in the Quran, if they contain these weak letters like wa or ya or alif, hamza, that it becomes impossible to find the derivatives and match them to the source. So for example, if you have words like waqaya or zanun alif or sad waw mim, etc., it is a debate. It's always going to be a matter of debate whether sawm is siyam. These are topics that I personally think are never going to be answerable, and I personally try and not get into that discussion. I'd keep myself onto the level of this word is used consistently in such way, but if I had to be asked to match a certain form to the source and I'm not certain, I don't think that can be done. Now again, I know this is a controversial point and I'll move on, but this is my current understanding on this particular topic. Continuing on to the next point. As I said, the who, the whom, the how, and the why, absolutely vital for me to understand what is happening in there. Now let's build on that. I've got two terms here, mafhum and ma'na. Mafhum, the overall gist of something, and the ma'na, the specific interpretation or the specific shade of that mafhum or the gist that gets applied. I think the Quran does that. So yes, the Mus'haf's words are derived from 2-letter or 3-letter roots, and sometimes there are combinations and concatenations where we might find words with a root of 4 or 5 letters, which is a combination of 2 or 3 words together, and we find it all the time in the Mus'haf. But ultimately they do, as we know, go down to a root. But once we start with a root, the root will always have a mafhum. The mafhum is the overall indication of what it is to be found in there. It's the overall gist. However, once that word gets applied into a specific context, the specific meaning of that overall gist will change to match the context. For example, let's just talk about something very simple. If we talk about a word such as qala, normally we would say he said, or qalat, she said. But if the context changes and we've got something like the Jahannam doing the talking, then qalat is not to say. It is the same mafhum, as in of having conversation or having meaning or having the passing of information from one to the other. But it is not a physical entity that is utilizing a tongue and lungs and all that goes along with it to actually physically talk in the way we talk. And again, this is something that we find in our current language as well. But it is a vital point that I don't find some people differentiating between. So whilst the overall meaning, overall mafhum, I should say, overall gist never changes, the specific ma'na or the specific shade does and will change based upon the context and the person or entity doing the action, or to whom or which the action is being done on. That, I think, is an absolutely vital point that once I understood, completely crystallized and, well, changed the way I engage with the Mus'haf. The other point that I like to talk about is the mabna, or the way a word is structured. So even if we have a very clear marking on the root of a word and one of the derivatives of it, we must acknowledge that the words are not the same. The mabna, or the construction of the two, is now different. Every time that I see a word whose construction is different from its source, then I say the meaning of that new derivative has necessarily changed from the source. They might still have a connection in terms of the overall mafhum or the overall gist, but the ma'na is now different. Let's continue on. Personally, I find huruf like bi, fi, an, min, ala, etc. in the Quran to have a significant effect on the meaning of what it is that you're reading. Again, it's the same thing in English as well. So if you were to just look at nouns, But the moment we start adding prepositions to them, the meaning starts to change. It's the same thing in Arabic as well. So I try to be very wary of this phenomena in the Quran as well. I don't always find this being done by a lot of other people. Again, it's not to show it's not to show that I'm better than others. It's just to say that we are all, to a certain level, guilty of not differentiating between what we read, especially once we have got these prepositions around in that pattern that we're looking at. Now let's talk about this one. I'd said in the very beginning, this dialectic, this friction between the external and the internal, you don't want to have one overwhelm the other. But ultimately, as I said in the very last point of my fundamentals, I do think that a successful methodology, which is what I hope to be working on, should allow me to incorporate and take what I find from the internal, apply this on the external. And if that works, it's in a way reinforces the truth value of the propositions offered by the internal. I hope you understood what I was trying to say there. Let's move on to the next point. We should observe word clouds and patterns and motifs that we keep seeing appearing all the time together. Whether it's by itself or whether they come along with certain personalities in the Mus'haf or events or descriptions. I think these are very valid things to keep an eye out for, because they help you understand. It illuminates the path for a better understanding of the Mus'haf. Now the next point, again, it could be considered blasphemous by some people. But I find no issues whatsoever in utilizing dictionaries or even ahadith or even modern Fusha Arabic, MSA, as aids. So if there is a specific word in the Quran, and we cannot, so first thing would be to obviously utilizing the principles of hermeneutics to try and go back and see how that same word is used by the same speaker within the same Mus'haf, to see what it is, what is the meaning, what is the referent, what is the understanding that we can grab from it. But there are times where you may need to go outside of that into the third world, the external. Now, whether it's ahadith or it's books of tariq or fiqh or dictionaries or modern MSA, it's fine to use them. For me, largely either to corroborate what I have already seen outside, or B, to get the overall gist of a specific word. So it could be to say, qala, how is it understood by dictionaries? Not how it was spoken by the people at the time the dictionary was written, but more to look at the mafhum of it. And that is where I think a lot of dictionaries, there are a couple of old Arabic dictionaries that do talk about the mafhum first and then say it has been used in this and that way as well, as in the mana. But most of them, if you were to find them, they capture the meaning of the word that was popular at the time the person was writing his dictionary, and that is fine. That is how we do it today as well. Meaning of gay, of all the possible meanings, we would start today as it pointing to those who are followers of a certain sexual orientation. But 60 years ago, it would have talked about the feeling of being happy. So we find a dictionary, all we need to be grabbing from it, or hadith or anything like that, is the overall mafhum, to make sure we understand how it works in the language before we start picking out the specific mana within the Mus'haf. The next point I know is also going to be probably controversial to a few people. But no, I don't think that the Quran is a secret love letter between the Creator and just one man who lived 14 centuries ago. Even when some of the Mus'haf's ayat seem to appear to directly refer to the first person, first recipient, or for his sake, or for his scenario, they are still applicable to us too, even if it is in meaning alone. So no, this is not just for one person. Everything we find in there, everything has a meaning and is there for us as well. And that is corroborated by the fact that we don't find any tafsir written for us, left behind for us by the first recipient. Let's continue on. And this is probably going to be a hard and bitter pill for some to swallow. But no, the Quran is not for people who do not wish to think. Now this might come across the wrong way, but ultimately after 5 years of study, I think it is not an easy book to... You get the overall meaning, and that's fine. There are parts, the basics that are absolutely clear. Do this, don't do that, these are your limits, etc. Everybody would understand them. But to engage with the whole, to get to the deeper levels of meaning, you need to be spending time. You need to be of a certain intellectual capacity before you begin to peel away those layers that others can't even see. So the audience of the Mus'haf, the real audience, is a different one from those who just read the words and expect hasanat for every letter that they utter. I'll leave it at that and I'll move on. Audience of the Mus'haf, yes, it's that specific people who use their mental capacities. Ultimately, it's not specific to us, whether to males or to females, but the audience is the nafs. So it says whatever it is within us that makes us human, that is the target for the Mus'haf. I will reiterate, even though I've talked about this many times before, Mus'haf should not be understood through the muddy prisms of hadith, the mu'allaqat, the poetry of the Jahiliyyah era, the asbabun nuzul, or how we say shanun nuzul in Urdu, the biblical narrative and the stories, the agreed upon tariq that's been accepted and agreed upon by the victors of all the wars that happened, etc., etc., or whatever the mu'azi, the parallel religion Islam says. The Quran just does not let itself be understood like that. So I reject it. When I reject it, I don't say that everything in the tradition is useless. All I say is that the prism is that we start from the Mus'haf, that internal, and then we go from inside out. We apply that to the external. Now, why have I gone that way is part of the last fundamental, as I talked about, that I mentioned to or referred to in the very beginning. Having had that dialectic for a very long time, having spent 5 years, I can say that what I find in the Mus'haf internally is a better way to look at the external versus applying the external and pushing contradictions into the internal, which doesn't work. I hope that made sense. Let's go on. As I said, I don't take any money for all that I do. I don't. I know there are a lot of people who do that. Now, whether some of them would be very obvious and say, pay me before I tell you anything, or pay me to join a specific club or a specific website or my community where I share with you secret disclosures to you first and nobody else, or whether it's me or somebody asking for PayPal donations is a very passive thing, or selling courses or books. I don't do any of that, and I don't want to do that because that really makes me be completely independent. I engage the way I want at my own pace and talk about things that interest me instead of being it the other way around. The next one again might be yet another bitter pill for people to swallow, and I've realized this just now that I might have been offering quite a few of those pills today, but I don't think the Quran can ever be translated. I really absolutely don't think so. End of the day, all we could ever capture is one person's limited understanding at a specific time of certain parts that he might have made mistakes on anyway. It would never, ever, ever be the actual Mus'haf, actual Quran. It just is not going to happen. I don't reject the efforts at people doing translations because it does help. As I said, the very basic meanings are obvious, and they don't really, you can't really muck about with them too much. But to go past that, if you are interested, you really have to start learning Arabic. There's just no other way around it. I will mention this second last point once more. I think it's the third or fourth time, but this has been for me the most vital finding in my 5 years of the Quranic engagement. We really need to know who is talking, to whom, for whom, why, how. For example, we have unreliable narrators in the Mus'haf. Did you know that? Not everything that the Quran says is true. Now, this is not a blasphemy. This is not just a huge lie. But when Iblis or Shaitan say something, we are not to take them as truthful. If they are making a claim or they are blaming somebody or Allah, that does not mean that they are correct. So we have to be very careful that we look at the bigger picture and put the right context in so we know how to engage with the text. And again, in the same vein, once you read the Mus'haf, you'll find, as I was saying before, it's got a specific style of narration. You will find parenthetical statements throughout the Mus'haf, and there are layers of topics woven like a tapestry. And you really need to appreciate the whole before you start making sweeping statements. I hope it made sense. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. And I will make a point here before I go into the last section that I think I would have lost a lot of people by this point. So if you have stuck around this long, then you are one who is serious, who wants to understand or wants to derive some lessons from me on my understanding and through my journey of engagement with the Mus'haf. So good on you. But I do think that methodology is absolutely vital, a correct one, a consistent one that allows you to continue to engage and continue to derive value out of. Right, let's try and conclude all of that. Where to from here? Knowledge grows. This is the Sunnatullah. End of the day, the source material hasn't changed, but our knowledge as species continues to grow. The tools that we have out there, it's just mind-boggling how much more we can do, how quickly, how easily we can engage with the text, the artifacts of what we, of the Mus'haf. And all of that means that we, generation by generation, know more about the Quran and what it points to, the ayat, than the generation before us did. That is a Sunnatullah. Ilm spreads, it builds upon itself, and we should be really thankful for it. We should be really happy for it, and we should encourage that. Having said that, as I made this point in the very beginning as well, let's talk about all that I presented today as my V1, my MVP of a methodology that I use right now that works for me as of this moment. This will also continue to grow. And in times to come, I might revisit this topic in a few years, maybe, and say, well, this is how I used to engage, or here were some of the tools that I had utilized, they were in my arsenal, but now I think about them slightly differently because A, B, C, D. So in time, I might I might bring up this topic again. But anyway, I thought this was something I had to present, this topic, my understanding of the methodology of the Quran and how I engage with the text as of right now. I really hope that if you've watched up to this point, you have gotten some value, some benefit. If you have, maybe make a note, tell us, write a comment in there. I do read everything you write, and if there's a question in this vein, let's have a chat about this as well. But until the next time, thank you for sticking with me. Assalamu alaikum.